Since the inception of film as an art form, we have had many people who have wanted to tell historical narratives through the art of filmmaking. And there's also been a little bit of a debate in regards to historical filmmaking, revolving around one simple question. Should a film based on a historical event be historically accurate? A subject that I've dealt with on this channel before. But before we get into the very obvious answer, let's go over some history of this debate. The most recent event that might have earned your attention on this topic was in regards to Ridley Scott's film about Napoleon, with Scott and the main actor, Joaquin Phoenix, giving interviews stating that rather than using the film to dispel common historical myths about Mr. Bonaparte, they would instead use the film to continue to perpetuate them. And when confronted about the many historical inaccuracies, Scott would respond with, "Excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut the fuck up then." Contrast that with another historical drama that was released that year, Oppenheimer, which was heavily praised for its historical accuracy, with many of its scenes apparently being word for word as they happened in real life. But this has been a bit of a debate for a long period of time. I don't know exactly when, but the argument seems to be made in reaction to the fact that many so-called historical films have had a history of stretching the truth, especially very early on. Take the 1952 film Viva Zapata, which has a scene where Zapata would end up becoming president of Mexico, but was too pure to remain in the position, and decided to leave and rejoin the revolution, with a separate subplot being about how Zapata couldn't read. Neither of these were remotely true at all. Very odd to make a movie based on a real historical figure, then just make stuff up, right? Why would the filmmakers choose to do this? Well, there are 3 reasons for doing so. 1, history is not up to date. The least common reason is that sometimes history will just catch up to a person. History might be definitive one year, then can be proven wrong by historians of the future. An example of which would be an adaptation of the life of Eugene Debs. For a long period of time, if there was a film adaptation that showed that, it would have his wife Kate as an adversary to his political ideals, as that was the historical narrative for the time period. But now, if we were to do an adaptation of it, Kate Debs will be portrayed in a positive role because historians have basically debunked that entire narrative. I say history is not up to date, but this could actually be more accurately be described as history was skewed to fit a narrative. The Kate example literally being because Eugene's brother Theodore really didn't want her to be perceived in any sort of favorable light, with a lot of other historical narratives in history basically being completely made up to serve a potential political narrative. This error might be more common in early historical films, but this is the least common, especially nowadays, considering nowadays, if we have a question about history, we can just pull something out of our pockets and find out right then and there, ignoring the fact that a filmmaker would probably have access to better materials than we do. Reason number 2 being to spice the film up. The most common reason to do so. The filmmaker thinks that the film is boring and decided to add a detail to spice things up. Maybe a person now has a love interest. Maybe they meet another historical figure during the film. Maybe a new tragic event happened. Maybe the film was running a bit short. I don't know. Either way, they felt that the narrative superseded the history and decided to change it. We'll tackle this in a bit, but first, let us go over the worst reason to change a historical film. Propaganda. Whether it be explicitly or implicitly, changes to a historical story in a movie adaptation can be used to spread a narrative about a figure or event. I think no figure is best exemplified by this than the abolitionist John Brown. His first media adaptation being the 1940 film Santa Fe Trail, in which Raymond Massey portrays John Brown as a raving lunatic who's in it for the violence, to the point where they have former slaves literally denounce him and his actions, clearly trying to push a message that is very critical of John Brown. However, 15 years later, Massey would play Brown again, this time more sympathetic. While the film still denounces his actions, it makes him look good. A person who knows nothing about John Brown will see this movie and hate him, and will see this movie, they'll have more mixed feelings. Another example comes from 2 different adaptations of the Battle of Fort Necessity, a battle during the French and Indian War, which was George Washington's first role in military combat. In the 1951 film, When the Redskins Rode, indigenous people are shown facing a massive defeat by the hands of George Washington, who, after winning the battle valiantly, kneels down in prayer for his fallen brothers, who gave their lives to save them from the savage invaders trying to ruin their way of life. Meanwhile, 33 years later, a mini-series about George Washington's life was produced that also depicted the battle, which showed Washington epically failing the battle and surrendering as soon as he was given command, which, if you need spelling out, is what actually happened. So now you might be wondering, what the heck was all this about? Well, let's recontextualize this entire thing. George Washington, the God-fearing father of America, defended his people from an invasion by the evil, godless Reds. I wonder what could have been going on in the 1950s that would make the US decide to make a movie with that message. But I digress. A question that a lot of you might be wondering is this. Are any of these reasons defendable?
No.
No nuance, no debate, nothing. Completely indefensible. Shock of all shocks. Extra, read all about it. Historical YouTuber thinks that historical film should be accurate. Shoot for 100% accurate if you can. Now let's go reason by reason. Number one is kind of unavoidable. If the historical narrative is pointing one way and there is literally nothing contradicting it, you can't really do anything about it. It's only interesting in retrospect when you find out that the historical narrative is so completely off from reality. Like basically any positive portrayal of Christopher Columbus. The third one is just flat out indefensible, and I would be hard pressed to find anybody who unironically defends it. I'm sure certain people will defend it, but they're just wrong. Changing history to pursue your own political narratives is wrong. History is history.
It's a similar sentiment to people who cry crocodile tears about history supposed to celebrate a nation. It isn't. History is literally just the study of the past. Its only job is to be accurate. What you feel about what has happened is a personal opinion. There are things in history that are sad. There are things in history to be honored, but removing either is not the answer, because that is revising history. Which makes sense considering the people who cry about it the loudest are historical revisionists who know nothing past elementary school history classes and simply want to spread a nationalistic narrative.
Most, if not all, of the arguments regarding this practice revolve around point number 2, which people seemingly think that it's the greatest defense of making inaccurate historical films. To which I say this. Want to make a fantasy movie? Make a fantasy movie. Want to make a historical film? Make a historical film. You don't get to do both. People get mad at the slightest change in a comic book adaptation, but will also be like, oh yeah, this historical film being blatantly inaccurate? That's perfectly fine. And I'm not saying take a historical figure and then feel like the day-to-day of his life. I'm talking about blatant fabrications made specifically to make the film more exciting. Take the Michael Bay film, Pearl Harbor, which during their depiction of the infamous attack has Japanese planes mowing down hospitals, a thing that not only did not happen, but goes against everything the Japanese military code stood for moral and practical reasons, with Bay saying that the reason why he did so was that he wanted to make Pearl Harbor more barbaric. So wait, you wanted to make a movie about the tragedy we know today as Pearl Harbor, and you looked at it and said, not tragic enough, so let me change this thing about it to make it more tragic. Imagine if I made a movie about 9/11, and I decided, you know what, 4 planes, not really that tragic. How about instead, there are 8 planes, and one of them is heading to the Statue of Liberty, one of them is heading to the Hollywood sign, one of them is heading to Mount Rushmore, and one of them is heading to a hospital with children with brain tumors. You'd rightfully go, what the f***? Why would you do that? Exactly. Why would you do that? The common response is, well, I mean, if we don't do it, then the movie will be boring. At that point, why not just make a documentary? Multiple points. 1, documentaries aren't boring. Most, if not all of them, are interesting, well put together movies, i.e. not boring, with many other documentaries being critical and financial successes. Michael Moore's films are prime examples. Remember when An Inconvenient Truth was a big point of conversation when it came out? I was 6 years old. And nowadays, we have the advent of video essayists. People who make multi-hour videos that delve into a subject that gets millions of views. A multi-hour piece of audiovisual media that delves into a specific subject and history relaying information? Wait, I've heard of these before. 2, history is not boring. Quite literally, of all the subjects in school, it's the least boring. And aside from literature, one of the easiest things you can adapt into the art of filmmaking. You can't make Calculus the movie, but want to make a movie about Harriet Tubman? Her whole story is right there, with tons of interesting things that can make a captivating story for audiences to see. If you, as a filmmaker, feel the need to change vital things about the historical narrative in order to spice things up, you're telling me you're a crappy writer, you're a crappy producer, and you're a crappy director. If you genuinely feel like having to rely on the historical narrative to tell a story about history is too bad for you, yeah, maybe you should be making a documentary. Or, better yet, quit and then have someone else do the thing that you have clearly shown you are incapable of doing. I literally do not think there is anything to gain from changing historical films other than spreading misinformation. And a lot of directors like to retort, well, this isn't history class, in order to brush away this fact, while at the same time going to every single interview, every single press junket, putting in every single trailer, this film is based on a true story. I wonder how I got the idea that this film was going to be historically accurate. You, like the rest of the film industry, are just false advertising. And the sad truth about it is that, unfortunately, this is history class. A lot of people will simply just watch historical films and not do any further research. An entire generation of children in the UK had their views on the Holocaust changed because the boy in the striped pajamas painted a very specific historical narrative that Bruno's death caused the Nazis to stop the Holocaust. That's not even something the film explicitly says, but people walked away with that in their mind. And this is the United Kingdom, people who are literally on the front lines against the Nazis. I don't know about you all, but me personally, I can't trust somebody who intentionally lies. Like, if you make a mistake, that's one thing. I'm not infallible in that regards either. But in these cases, it is always intentional. You saw how Joaquin Phoenix and Ridley Scott reacted when called out. Not, oh, we thought this was real. Our bad for spreading misinformation. It was, lol, we don't care, nerd. If you're gonna blatantly lie about one thing in this historical film, how can I trust literally anything else that is stated? I'll use the Clint Eastwood film The Mule as an example. It's a movie that is spaced around the story of Leo Sharp, an old man who ended up becoming a drug mule for the Sinaloa cartel, with Eastwood playing the lead. During the movie, his estranged wife begins to exhibit symptoms of an illness later revealed to be in terminal cancer. While watching it, I predicted that she had cancer, and rather than waiting for the confirmation of the film, I just pulled out my phone and Googled it. And that's when I learned that the entire wife plotline was made up. They were not divorced, and she did not die of cancer. It was Clint Eastwood pushing his own trauma into the movie. And I immediately just stopped caring about the movie. Like, literally, the story was interesting already. You did not have to just make things up in order to make the movie better. Doing so only made me not like the movie as much as I probably would have. Now, I guess I should address one elephant in the room that some of you might have been clamoring about. What about historical fiction? That's a slightly more complicated matter. For those who don't know, historical fiction is where you set a fictional story in a major historical event. Some examples of historical fiction you might know are Titanic, Hamilton, X-Men First Class, Forrest Gump, etc. You know what else is historical fiction? The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I've already shown the issues with that film, so yes, even if it is historical fiction, I would argue historical accuracy is of the utmost importance. The only condition to allow for inaccuracies is if you do it in a way that it cannot be mistaken for historical fact. Hamilton does it by casting people of color to play the white slave owners we call the Founding Fathers. The Leader does it by making it a Dong Hua, and Forrest Gump does it by making it so outlandish that there isn't a single ounce of possibility that anybody could mistake this film for being historical. Oh, come the f*** on! So yeah, the obvious answer is obvious. Yes, historical film should be accurate. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click that bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.